This church is a little larger than my little church of 40 people. Love the music, it's great. Had a great time with the city conversations Friday night. And thank you, Stephen, for inviting me to do that. This is fun. I think I like Little Rock a whole lot better than Dallas, especially this summer. So, what I want to talk to you about is what we have now, what they wrote then. That is the Bible that we hold in our hands today the same one that was written so many centuries ago? I want to tell you a story about a monk named Brother Andrew. He was a monk in Ireland in the 12th century. And each monastery had their own rules. I've been to many, many monasteries to find and photograph Greek New Testament manuscripts, but they had those even in Ireland. And so he was a brand new monk. He had just been sent from his training, and the abbot who trained him wrote this recommendation letter. And he said to the other abbot, he said, "Brother Andrew is a bit strange. He's really focused. He hardly notices anything that's going on around him. He's not personable. He's not likable. I think he'll fit in well with your monastery." So when the new abbot at the monastery looked at the recommendation letter, he said, "Andrew, I have just the job for you. I want you to copy out our codes of conduct that we've had for centuries." So he put him in a room, and Andrew starts writing these codes out, copying them. And he came back into the abbot's office. He said, "Holy Father, do you have older manuscripts? Because these are fairly recent, and they're all saying the same thing, which is great, but I want to see older manuscripts to see if they got it right." So he said, "Well, yeah, I could take you to another room." And so he actually took him down to the bowels of the monastery, a labyrinthian path down to this vault. And the original document of their codes was there. And so Andrew starts copying it out. And all of a sudden there was a knock on the door at the abbot's office. And it wasn't just one hand, it was 40 hands pounding on the door. He opens the door, and all these other monks said, "Holy Father, that new guy down there is nuts. You got to come see." And so they all scurry down the labyrinthian paths and get down to the vault. And Brother Andrew is beating his head on the desk and saying, "They left out an R. They left out an R." And the abbot thought, this guy really is anal. Oh, is that okay to say here? I'm sorry. Andrew said, "The word is supposed to be celebrate." Now, you guys were the slowest to catch that one. Did you all graduate from Texas A&M by any chance? All right, so it is important to get the details right when it comes to Scripture especially. And let's see if we did, or if we have we left out an R? Well, let me start by quoting some skeptics. Let me begin with that great scholar, Dan Brown. Hopefully you know who he is. And in Da Vinci Code, he said, "The Bible has evolved through countless translations, additions, and revisions. History has never had a definitive version of the book." Well, that's a novel. Here's Newsweek, supposed to be a little bit more factual. And Kurt Eichenwald, who graduated from a private high school in Dallas, St. Mark's High School, which was supposed to give religious training, and it went the way of so many schools, especially Methodists, but I won't get into that. Nevertheless, Kurt Eichenwald wrote this article in Newsweek, and notice it appeared December 23rd, 9 years ago. When you get criticisms of the Bible, of the resurrection, of the Christian faith, you get a highlight of these, a large smattering of these right at Christmas time or Easter. That's when they always come out. In other words, you Christians celebrate Christmas, but just think about Santa Claus. Don't think about Jesus, because that's a myth. And at Easter, of course he wasn't raised from the dead. That's when these things happen. So here's his rather objective article. And in this article, he has a section called Plain Telephone with God. No television preacher has ever read the Bible. Neither has any evangelical politician. Neither has the Pope. And neither have I. So far, I'd say he's probably right. And neither have you. At best, we've all read a bad translation of translations of hand-copied copies of copies of copies of copies, and on, hundreds of times. Well, if that's true, we might as well just fold up the building right now and go to the park and have a picnic, eat, drink, and be merry. Now, a little bit more seriously, a fellow by the name of C.J. Werleman, who has written a couple of books. He's an atheist. And the first book he wrote was called God Hates You, Hate Him Back. He kind of likes provocative titles, but I think it's an ironic title because he's an atheist. God hates you? He should say, nothing hates you, hate nothing back. Because there is no God as far as he's concerned. You guys got to kind of lighten up here. This is going to be a long message if you don't, seriously. He said, we do not have any of the original manuscripts of the Bible. The originals are lost. We don't know when, and we don't know by whom. What we have are copies of copies. In some instances, the copies we have are 20th generation copies. I don't know where he got that last line from. But even a more serious person, Muslims have apologists as well, and some of them are very, very good students of the Bible. M.M. al-Azami is Britain's leading Muslim apologist. And in a book he wrote comparing the Quran with Old and New Testament, he said, the Orthodox Church, being the sect which eventually established supremacy over all the others, stood in fervent opposition to various ideas, also known as heresies, which were in circulation. These included adoptionism, the notion that Jesus was not God but a man, and separationism, that the divine and human elements of Jesus Christ were two separate beings. And did I skip Docetism? I'm sorry. The opposite view, that he was God and not man. In each case, this sect, the one that would rise to become the Orthodox Church, deliberately corrupted the scriptures so as to reflect its own theological visions of Christ while demolishing that of all rival sects. He is speaking about the year AD 325, when the first emperor to become a Christian, Constantine, inaugurated this thing called the Council of Nicaea that ended up defining what they meant by the deity of Christ. But he's still not a New Testament scholar. But if he's right, we should just close the doors and go home. Here's a bona fide scholar, Bart Ehrman. Bart and I have been friends for over 40 years. I met him when he was earning his PhD at Princeton Seminary under the great Bruce Metzger, a fine evangelical Presbyterian scholar, probably the best textual scholar, the one textual critic. A textual critic is someone who tries to determine the exact wording of an original document when we no longer have that original document. And he was probably the finest New Testament textual critic of the 20th century. Bart was his last student, and he wrote this, a popular book, first time a popular book on how we got our Bible in terms of the transmission of the Greek manuscripts that the New Testament is based on, in a lay book. Not only do we not have the originals, we don't have the first copies of the originals. We don't even have copies of the copies of the originals or copies of the copies of the copies of the originals. Bart called himself a Christian when he was at Princeton and had a conversion experience. He went to Moody Bible Institute and got his first degree from Wheaton College. Then he got a master's degree at Princeton Seminary and earned his doctorate there too. Several years later, his faith started to just chip away. And today, he is America's leading apologist against Christianity. Now, Bart and I have had 3 debates over the years. And I would say that his book, Misquoting Jesus, there are hundreds of thousands of copies that have been sold. In fact, the first 100,000 were sold in the first 3 months. And at one point during that time, he was on a show. It was I can't remember the guy's name, but nevertheless, he was on a popular TV show, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, I think. Is that right? Some of you remember. I'm an old timer when I say that. And Stewart said, "Wow, this is a hell of a book." I'm quoting him. He said, "Wow, these variants, it kind of makes you feel that the Bible is more godly, more spiritual somehow." He had no idea what he was talking about, but Bart Ehrman is now a leading atheist. The next day, the book was #1 on Amazon after that interview with Jon Stewart. And so later in his book, he said, "The more I studied the manuscript tradition of the New Testament, the more I realized just how radically the text had been altered over the years at the hands of the scribes. It would be wrong to say, as people sometimes do, that the changes in our text have no real bearing on what the texts mean or on the theological conclusions that one draws from them." Bart Ehrman is a bona fide textual critic, a world-class scholar. And these others that I just quoted got their information especially from him and some other scholars who have published in the popular realm, but Bart Ehrman especially. Well, isn't this wonderful news? I think my time's up. Let's close in prayer. Now I'm going to tell you the rest of the story. When we think about how the New Testament came about and the copies we have today, the Bible you hold in your hands, there's two attitudes that we need to avoid. The first is radical skepticism. I just gave you a bunch of illustrations of that. The second, though, is absolute certainty. And many Christians have absolute certainty about their Bibles. You might say, the Bible you hold in your hands, the ESV, I understand that's the translation that's used here. You might say, this is the Word of God in every single word. No, it is not. First of all, it's a translation of Greek and Hebrew. And secondly, even the ESV and all other translations go through some tweaks as more manuscripts are discovered, earlier manuscripts, as scholars start to wrestle with the data that's out there and decide what the original text should say. The ESV will change. The NIV has changed a couple of times. Every Bible, even the King James Bible, went through 3 revisions. We do not have absolute certainty that the Bible we hold in our hands is in every word the Word of God. So where between these two extremes of radical skepticism and absolute certainty should we be? Well, I want to ask 4 questions this morning. First of all, how many textual variants are there? What kinds of textual variants are there? What's the theological beliefs that depend on these? Is our faith hanging in the balance on a textual variant? And has the essence of the Christian faith been corrupted by the scribes like so many of these skeptics have said? So let me begin with a preliminary question. Don't we have the original New Testament anymore? The answer to that is no, we don't. All of the books, all 27 books of the New Testament, must have turned to dust within about a century or so from examination and copying. In the early church, someone might hear about, you Christians in Rome got a letter from Paul. Well, I'm in Corinth. I'm going to come and visit you, and I've got a scribe with me. Can he copy out this letter that was written to you? Yes. Oh, and by the way, we have a couple of letters here too. This news got around. Individuals were copying scripture for themselves, for their churches. And because of the explosion of the Christian faith, starting on the day of Pentecost, these manuscripts started to get copied and copied and copied, and they just wore out from frequent copying. So we don't have the originals anymore. Well, what if all the manuscripts we do have were identical in their wording, unlike what Brother Andrew discovered? Well, I guess we'd say that's probably what the original text said. That's what Muslims say about the Quran, by the way. They say all the copies are exactly like. That's actually not true. I've seen a bunch of Quran manuscripts where there's erasures and changes, but if you don't know what the Quran says or haven't studied the manuscripts, you can say those things. So the fact is that there are no 2 manuscripts that agree completely. In fact, the closest 2 manuscripts we have of the many manuscripts that we do have In the first 8 centuries, the two closest manuscripts of the first 800 years disagree between 6 and 10 places per chapter. Per chapter. That means there's about 3,000 differences between them if they were complete New Testaments. So because the original has disappeared and because the manuscripts disagree, we have to do what's called textual criticism. So here's the last preliminary question. Don't worry, I usually go for about half my messages on a preliminary question. So just lighten up, ease back in your seat, just, snore if you want to. But is this being recorded, by the way? Okay, then whatever you want. I want to ask another preliminary question. What is a textual variant? It's any place among the manuscripts in which there's any variation in wording, even word order, omission or addition of words, even spelling differences. Those are textual variants. And for example, in John 4:1, we have now when Jesus knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John. But there are other manuscripts that instead of saying when Jesus knew, it says when the Lord knew. There's about 1,000 manuscripts that have when the Lord knew. Does that mean that there are 1,000 variants there? No, it means that's one variant attested 1,000 times. Let me give you the specifics. In the Greek New Testament, we have approximately 138,162 words, give or take a few. In terms of textual variants, this is a bar that should illustrate that for you. This is to scale. About 1.5 million variants. So have I presented a good case on the other side? Sounds kind of scary, doesn't it? Let me get into the details now for you. C.S. Lewis once said, the moment the miracle enters nature's realm, it obeys all her laws. Miraculous wine will intoxicate. Miraculous conception will lead to pregnancy. Inspired books will suffer all the ordinary processes of textual corruption. Miraculous bread will be digested. But why are there so many variants? What do they do to our confidence in the Bible? So why are there so many textual variants? For one simple reason. There are a lot of manuscripts. 300 years ago, a scholar by the name of Richard Bentley, brilliant scholar at Cambridge University, worked especially on the Greek New Testament. In 1713, he published a book called Remarks Upon a Discourse of Free Thinking. 6 years prior to this, a man named John Mill spent his entire academic career, 30 years at Oxford University, writing one book. And it was the text of the Greek New Testament with a list of the variants that he had discovered. Now, this was 1707. And John Mill, exactly to the date after, 2 weeks after the day that he published this book, he died, which is what I'm hoping to happen when I write my magnum opus, because that way I can avoid all the critics, There were fundamentalist Christians. He actually discovered 30,000 textual variants after looking at 99 Greek New Testament manuscripts and early translations and church fathers' quotations. 30,000 textual variants. And he listed all those. So you have a text above, then a line, then footnotes that are longer than the text above. Fundamentalist Christians said, you did the work of the devil. Roman Catholics were really happy about what happened because they said, look, our Pope speaks ex cathedra, but your paper Pope disagrees with himself on every single page. So Richard Bentley actually defended him, and what he said is, if there had been but one manuscript of the Greek Testament at the Restoration of Learning about 2 centuries ago, then we would have had no various readings at all. And would the text be in a better condition then than it is now that we have 30,000 variant readings? It is good, therefore, to have more anchors than one, and another manuscript to join the first would give more authority as well as security. So New Testament scholars welcome all these manuscripts, and they sift through the variants, and here's the actual issue that we are facing today. New Testament textual criticism suffers from an embarrassment of riches, while as textual criticism on any other classical work, Greco-Roman, that is Greek or Latin work, suffers from a dearth of data. They just don't have very much to work with. We have way too much to work with. How many Greek New Testament manuscripts have been found so far? The official number is 5,999. Now, that official number is off a little bit because sometimes a manuscript had gone missing afterwards, even after it was photographed, and sometimes they found that it was part of another manuscript. But nevertheless, we can be sure that we have at least 5,500 Greek New Testament manuscripts today. That's incredible. And my job as the director of the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts is to go around the world with my team and examine these manuscripts and then get them digitized, posted online at our website so that scholars of any theological belief, lay people of any belief, can look at those images, hundreds of thousands of images, to help tweak what we have as far as what we think the original text of the New Testament said, so that we can rid ourselves of the few places where we are really unsure. So we have this many Greek manuscripts, but the New Testament was again translated into many other languages. Latin started to get copies of the New Testament as late as the late second century, as early as the late second century. We have maybe 10,000, we're not exactly sure, but there's other languages as well. Other ancient versions like Coptic and Syriac and Armenian and Old Church Slavonic. We guess it's somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 of these manuscripts. When we define a manuscript, it's a copy of a portion of the New Testament or the whole written before the time of the printing press. This is 25,000 manuscripts we're talking about. Now, even though most of them are not a complete New Testament, the average size manuscript is 400 pages long. That's a lot of material. But if I had a magic wand and I could just wave these all away, poof, they're gone. Would we not know what the apostles and their associates wrote? No, we still have the witness of the church fathers. And these patristic writers were not given the gift of brevity. They made commentaries on the books of the New Testament. And there are many, many manuscripts that have 4 lines of text and then it's surrounded by 3 columns of commentary in much smaller font. And these church fathers, going back to the late first century, AD 96, start quoting the New Testament. And many of them begin to discuss textual variants and say, I know about this word over here, but here's the word over here. And I'll talk about one of those that was disputed. I'll give you a couple examples at the end. But just the quotations by the church fathers of the New Testament, there's more than 1 million of them. We could virtually reproduce the entire New Testament many times over from the quotations of the church fathers alone. That's an embarrassment of riches. Well, how does this compare to the average classical work? The average classical author, and I'm being generous here, has fewer than 15 copies of his or her works. And you stack them up, it'd be about 4 feet high, so right around here. Now, let's compare that to the New Testament stack. This is what it would look like. About the height of a podium for a classical author. What do you use for the New Testament? Well, how about the Empire State Building? Now let's make a comparison. That's not to scale. Let's do it to scale this time. You see that dot? I am a detail person. This really is to scale. That's a 4-foot-high stack of classical books, manuscripts. New Testament, one Empire State Building, 1,454 feet tall. I got a lot of room left here, though, don't I? We can easily say that we have more than a mile high of handwritten manuscripts of the New Testament. I'm not even counting the church fathers. I have no idea how to quantify that. More than a mile high of manuscripts, handwritten before the time of the printing press, and the actual number comes to around 6,235. 4.5 Empire State Buildings stacked on top of each other. I'd call that an embarrassment of riches, wouldn't you? Now, let's do it to some specifics. Greco-Roman historians and biographers, and I don't have time to go through all of these, but let me just mention these are well-known authors who had far more than 15 copies of their books overall. Pliny the Elder, Plutarch, Josephus, Pliny the Elder, a great historian. Plutarch wrote the lives of many famous people. Josephus wrote the Antiquities of the Jews and the Jewish War. He's the one who wrote about Palestine, Israel, even about Jesus from about AD 50 to 100 when he died, and he actually goes back in time to the beginning, talks about Herod the Great. A lot of our information about the background to the New Testament comes right from Josephus. Herodotus wrote the histories. He was the father of ancient historiography, how to write history. Xenophon, his book Hellenica, tells about a great war. Great authors, lots of copies. Pliny has 200 copies. That's really amazing. And the oldest substantial one is 700 years later. The first fragment comes 250 years after Pliny, but the next one is 700 years. Plutarch, 800 years for the very first copies we have of Plutarch today. Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, we have 20 manuscripts, but none of them are earlier than the 9th century. Herodotus, another father of history. His histories, we have 109 manuscripts, and the first substantial ones, more than just a small scrap of papyrus or something, 1,500 years after he wrote. And Xenophon's Hellenica, the first substantial manuscripts came almost 1,800 years after he wrote. Now think about that. We've got some small fragments here and there. We do have small fragments for the New Testament called papyri. Some of them are actually very large fragments, many, many pages. But what if our New Testament were like Xenophon's Hellenica? What would you compare that to? Well, this would be an accurate comparison. The first substantial copies of the New Testament would have come out about the time that the Wright brothers invented the airplane. When you talk to your friends at the office or at Starbucks or wherever you go that are not believers, and they like to bring up the argument, gee, we are waiting for copies and copies and copies of copies, sometimes 20th generation copies. We have no idea where that one came from. But even if that's true, compare that to any other ancient literature, and it's an embarrassment of riches that we have. So I would have to say that for the New Testament, on average, we have about 1,000 times or more manuscripts, material, than we do for any classical author on average. That's astounding. Okay, but what if all these really were copies of copies of copies of copies and they came really late? Well, let's talk about the date of some of these manuscripts. In the year 1844, Ferdinand Christian Bauer started the Tübingen School in Tübingen, Germany, a great university for theological studies. He was the father, in a sense, of modern liberal studies on the New Testament. And in that year, he published an article in a journal where he said he applied Hegelian dialectic to the New Testament. Now, to mention Hegelian dialectic on a Sunday morning is a real snoozer. Don't leave yet, please. You might not know it by that name, but you know it by thesis, antithesis, and what's this? You don't even know synthesis, right? Are you awake here? Got bright lights. One more time. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Okay, let me give you an illustration. High school daughter says, Dad, I want to get a tattoo on my ankle, just on my ankle. Dad says, you are not going to get a tattoo anywhere. That's antithesis. Synthesis, she gets a tattoo on her ankle and asks forgiveness. So not exactly this. But here's what Bauer did. He said the Gospel of John is a synthesis between the Paul school and the Peter school of Christianity, and it could not have been written prior to AD 160. His date was AD 170. The rest of Europe, for the next 100 years almost, followed suit. And most scholars in Germany were dating John's gospel well into the 2nd century and saying it doesn't have any historical relevance whatsoever. But then in 1934, 90 years after Bauer published this article, C.H. Roberts, a newly minted PhD, was working on some papyrus fragments that were bequeathed to the Manchester University Library. And he was reading through these papyri. Papyri, the ancient paper, basically. It's what all books were written on until the 3rd century AD, when parchment, animal skin, started to be used. And he came across a scrap of papyrus about the size of a credit card. I'm showing you a picture of one side of this. It's known as papyrus number 52, or P52. And as he read through this, he was very excited to see that this is from John's gospel. It's from John chapter 18, verses 31 to 33. The backside was chapter 18, verses 37 and 38. Well, that tells him a couple of things. First of all, we have a professional hand here that wrote John, so it's something that was considered important and needs to get out there for others to read. And he knew it was written on a codex, not a scroll. All books until the 1st century AD, the late 1st century AD, were written on a scroll. You've heard of that. All the books in the Library of Alexandria, they're all rolls stuffed into different cubicles, and you'd identify them on the outside. But as far as we know, the codex form was began in the late 1st century, and although Christians did not invent it, they were the first to really use it extensively. And for the first 500 years of Christianity, over 90% of all Christian books were written on a codex. During that same 500 years, less than 15% of books that were not written by Christians, any other literature, were written on codices. So for the first 500 years of the Christian faith, Christians were leading in technology. And it's the first and only time, I think, that we were ahead of the technological curve. But at least we got that. Now, what is a codex? It's a book that's bound on one side, and it has cut pages that you can flip and turn. Most of you probably have a few codices in your house. They're called books. Now, if you're under 30, you might never have seen a codex, because the only kind of book you know about is on a computer screen, and you've gone retro on us because you scrolled to get to the place you want to go. Well, Roberts was very excited about this discovery. He sent photographs to the 3 leading papyrus scholars, papyrologists in the world, and each one of them wrote back to him and said, this manuscript should be dated between 100 and 150, and much closer to 100. All 3 of them said that. And a 4th one, a German, demurred from that. He said, no, I think this manuscript was probably written in the 90s. Now, I don't know what you're taught here in Arkansas, but I grew up in Southern California, Newport Beach, hence the Hawaiian shirts that I always wear. This is my dress Hawaiian shirt. It was informal Friday night, a different one. But I was taught that, generally speaking, a copy of something is not made before the original is. Is that what you're taught too? Copies come later, right? How can you have a copy come before the original of John's gospel? This sent 2 tons of German scholarship to the flames. It reminds me of a saying that a scholar had on his desk: an ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption. In this case, an ounce of evidence is worth 2 tons of presumption. There are people that come up with the screwiest ideas about Christianity, and I heard some after I spoke Friday night about Jesus being one of the only solar gods who came to earth, just all sorts of weird things. And I've heard just so many different views about the Christian faith that are based on somebody's philosophy or sometimes what they're smoking, I'm not sure, but we have evidence on our side. You always have to ask, what's your evidence for that view? What basis do you have for that? An ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption. Now, just to give you some early evidence of our manuscripts, if we just go through the first 900 years after the book of Revelation was completed, through the 10th century, you see we have as many as 12 manuscripts in the 2nd century, papyri. And we get more and more and more. By the 4th century, as many as 121 manuscripts. And there we have our first complete New Testament. And yet the manuscripts prior to that, the 2nd and 3rd century, we have manuscripts sometimes that are as much as 80 or 85 pages, or leaves, so about 170 pages long, papyrus. By the time you get to the end of the 10th century, we have almost 1,000 manuscripts. This is just in Greek. The next century, the numbers double. Now, if you were to compare that to average Greco-Roman, we have 4 times more New Testament manuscripts within the first 200 years than the Greco-Roman author has in 2000. Within 900 years of the New Testament's completion, we have almost 1,000 manuscripts in Greek alone. Within 900 years of the average classical author's writings, there are 0 manuscripts. So when somebody says, yeah, but how can you tell it's reliable? Well, if it's not, then we might as well go back to the Dark Ages, because we should have questioned all that stuff that Western Europe learned about in 1453 and got these manuscripts. That's how the Reformation got started too. Greek began to be learned in Western Europe because of all these scribes with their manuscripts from Istanbul fleeing a war. And all that stuff really gave birth to the Renaissance. Took us out of the Dark Ages. Now we should just throw all that information away because it's all wrong. Everything you've learned from the ancient historians, even the mathematicians, all this, no, they never got it right. Well, has the Bible been translated and retranslated so many times that we don't know what it originally said? This is the first question, so I understand I have 3 minutes left. I better hurry. No, I'll finish this, no worry. This is the one I take the longest time on. In 1611, the King James Bible came out. It was based essentially on 8 Greek New Testament manuscripts. The earliest one was 600 years before it, 11th century, and that was the one that was used the least. Today, we have over 5,500 Greek New Testament manuscripts, and the earliest go back to the 2nd century. As time goes on, we are getting closer and closer to the original text, not farther and farther away. We still have those manuscripts that stand behind the King James Bible. When scribes copied out a text, they didn't destroy the original and just pass on the copies. We do have copies of copies, but we have those copies up the chain too. So what kinds of textual variants are there? Well, over 99% make virtually no difference at all. For example, differences in spelling. Some Aggie made that for me, I'm sorry. Differences in spelling. You knew what I meant though. I'm going to give you an illustration here. And Stephen, I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm not going to ask you out loud, but I want you to think through how many ways there are to say John loves Mary in Greek. This is a question for any Greek geek. And this will show up on the quiz when I put these up. So here's some items to consider. The word order in Greek is very, very flexible. It's not nearly like English. You could put those words in any order you wanted and it still means the same thing because of the endings on the words. The Greek definite article sometimes appears with proper names, sometimes not. And that article, there are 20,000 of these little buggers in the Greek New Testament. I wrote my master's thesis on when it does not occur. I wrote my doctoral dissertation on when it does occur. 2 works that would cure the most hopeless insomniacs. And I still don't understand. None of us understands really why the article is used with proper names. You could have the John loves Mary, Mary loves the John. The article's there. It doesn't affect one item of doctrine. It doesn't seem to make a whole lot of difference. Then there's differences in spelling. For example, the name in John is Ioannes or Ioannes, 2 N's, 1 N. So here's how many ways you could say John loves Mary in Greek. Write these down. It'll show up on the quiz at the end. Oh, this is not all there are. "96 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek." These are all textual variants off that first one. Oh, I'm not done. Now with conjunctions that are often untranslated. These are all different, I assure you. I spent 8 hours putting this together. And then I realized, oh, sorry. Just missed the last one. Here we go. 384 ways. 384 ways to say John loves Mary in Greek without even changing the word loves. Now, I decided there are others. I found some others after I put that together. I'm too tired to make more, but over 500 ways to say John loves Mary in other legitimate word orders. And a paraphrastic construction for loves doubles that to 1,000. Every single time, John loves Mary, and it's the same word for loves. Now, you use a different verb for loves, and now you mushroom the numbers to 2,000. So what does this have to do with anything? Well, let's put it in this context. Bart Ehrman said we could go on nearly forever talking about specific places in which the texts of the New Testament came to be changed, either accidentally or intentionally. The examples are not just in the hundreds, but in the thousands. Well, he's right. But if we can say John loves Mary over 1,000 times in Greek without changing the meaning, the number of textual variants for the New Testament is meaningless. 1.5 million, 10 million, it doesn't matter. What matters is the nature of these variants. Because the more manuscripts we have, as Bentley said, the surer we are what the original text is. And that's why CSNTM does what it does. We have discovered 75 manuscripts, more than any other institute in the 21st century. And we've gotten those posted online for people to see. All of this helps us to get to the exact wording of the New Testament. Let's talk about the nature of these variants. Well, some can be not meaningful, that is, they don't change the meaning at all, like we've got with John loves Mary, whether the article is used or not viable. Not viable means there's absolutely no way that that particular variant in that late 14th century manuscript could go back to the original. And then we've got those that are meaningful but not viable, and those that are viable but not meaningful. Less than 1% are meaningful. It changes the meaning a little bit, like when Jesus knew or when the Lord knew. That changes the meaning. It doesn't change the referent, but we count that as a legitimate textual variant. But the smallest group of variants, the only ones textual scholars really are interested in, really talk about, are the ones that are meaningful and viable, and less than 1/10 of 1% of all textual variants fit this group. So you hear these massive numbers. That just doesn't matter. We're dealing with 1/10, less than 1/10 of 1% of that. So let me give you a couple of illustrations. First of all, Mark chapter 9, verse 29. Jesus' disciples had tried to cast out some demons, and they were unsuccessful. Particularly pesky demons, I guess. So they came to Jesus. Why can't we cast these demons out? He said to them, this kind can only be cast out by prayer. Or did he say, this kind can only be cast out by prayer and fasting? And fasting, I put in brackets. A lot of manuscripts, a lot of important manuscripts add and fasting. This is the only place in the New Testament that I can find where fasting seems to be required. So it's not a matter of orthodoxy, but of orthopraxy. If you are in the business of exorcisms, you might hedge your bet and just not only pray, but fast too. I don't know how relevant that's going to be for most of us, but nevertheless, that's a legitimate, meaningful, and viable variant. Here's one that everybody should know. Anybody on the streets of Little Rock should know that the number of the beast is 666, right? That number occurs only one place, Revelation 13:18. Let the one who has insight calculate the beast number, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Is it really? In 1844, a scholar named Constant Tischendorf was working at the Bibliothèque Nationale, the National Library of France in Paris. And he was examining a manuscript that had been scraped off, a parchment manuscript from about AD 400, and all of it had been scraped off. It was originally an entire Bible. And those letters were scraped, and then the manuscript was reused, and somebody wrote sermons on top of it, which meant that undertext was nearly impossible to read. Tischendorf spent 2 years going through 157 leaves to decipher that undertext, and he was able to read 99% of it. I had the opportunity to go to the Bibliothèque Nationale several years ago and looked at that passage, and sure enough, this manuscript, which is one of the 2 most important manuscripts we have of the book of Revelation, says very clearly the number of the beast is 616. But that's only one manuscript. Now, most scholars would say 666, that's the number of the beast. 616, that's the neighbor of the beast. He lives a couple doors down, you know. It's something I really wrestle with because another manuscript was discovered in 1998, which happens to be the earliest papyrus, the earliest manuscript, oldest manuscript we have for Revelation. We have these two witnesses, but we have some other things that suggest it. Some days I wake up and I say, I think the number of the beast is 666. Other days, no, I think it's 616. I'm sure that's how you start your days, thinking about the number of the beast, right? Well, I'm the senior editor of the Net Bible, and I have had some carnal desires to change the text at Revelation 13:18 and put the number of the beast is 616. That would send about 7 tons of popular Christian literature to the flames, wouldn't it? That passage, the number 666, is important. But how important is it? I don't know of a single doctrinal statement of a church, of a seminary, of a denomination, of a Bible college, of any group that has in its doctrinal statement, we believe in the deity of Christ, we believe in the virgin of Christ, the virgin birth of Christ, we believe in the resurrection of Christ, and we believe that the number of the beast is 666. It may be important, but it's not that important. Back to the year 325, the Council of Nicaea, my dear Tibbing declared, until that moment in history, he was speaking to Sophie, Jesus was viewed by his followers as a mortal prophet, a great and powerful man, but a man nonetheless, immortal. This is what that Muslim said. Christians changed the text. And basically what he is saying here, what Tibbing is saying, what the Muslim scholar is saying is that the deity of Christ was changed in AD 325. There was no deity of Christ before then. He was a mortal man. Remember how I said an ounce of evidence is worth a pound of presumption? Here's that ounce of evidence. Here's a manuscript that has most of John's gospel. This is the first page, written about 200, maybe 250, at least 75 years before the Council of Nicaea. It's evidence, maybe 125 years before. This is John 1:1. Read along with me, if you will. In the first verse, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God. You've never heard that before, of course, because that was invented by Constantine. No, it was already there. Every single manuscript of John's gospel, no matter the date or the language, says the same thing in John 1:1. Jesus is unequivocally called God. Now, the important thing is the same can be said for the major passages that affirm his deity, his virgin birth, his sinlessness, death on the cross, his bodily resurrection, his second coming. Every single cardinal doctrine does not hang on any textual variant. All of them are clear. And the variants don't disturb those. So has the essence of the Christian faith been corrupted by the scribes? Let me quote Sir Frederick Kenyon from 90 years ago, a paleographer extraordinaire, the principal librarian at the British Museum, and a fine Christian man who worked on papyri and ancient manuscripts. The general result of all these discoveries and all this study is to strengthen the proof of the authenticity of the scriptures and our conviction that we have in our hands in substantial integrity the veritable word of God. That's something we can say. We have in our hands in substantial integrity the veritable word of God. We have the word of God, and as far as the words of God are concerned, we know that these manuscripts don't disturb the doctrines. But there are a few particulars, small particulars, that may affect the meaning in a passage. But don't just take my word or Kenyon's word, take Bart Ehrman's word. In his paperback edition of Misquoting Jesus, which was added a few months after the hardbound book, the editors wanted to beef it up, so they had an appendix, and they asked him a question. Why do you disagree with your professor, Dr. Metzger, that variants change doctrine? Here's what Bart Ehrman had said. If you can get to half-price books, get the paperback edition, page 252. Why do you believe these core tenets of Christian orthodoxy to be in jeopardy based on the scribal errors you discovered in the biblical manuscripts? Here's his response. Essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. Hundreds of thousands of Christian kids have been exposed to the lie that they are. And many, many have left the Christian faith because of books like this that don't tell the whole story. So let me conclude with a very unnatural segue. I'm going to show you a picture of a polar bear who's attacking a man. Hopefully you have not had breakfast yet, but let me just ask you to close your eyes and envision this. A polar bear is attacking a man. I'll show you some real pictures. Keep your eyes closed. Now, take a look. I'm telling the truth. A polar bear is attacking a man. Think of that polar bear as all the textual variants. And that man is the New Testament. He might get scratched up a little bit. Probably not. He might just lose a couple of threads from his Levi 501 blues. But I want to tell you, friends, the Bible you have in your hands is the veritable Word of God, and you can take it to the bank. Thank you for your attention.